This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional life that you're happy with. In this episode, I have a conversation with Rob Cottingham, a communications professional I've known for some time. It's a little bit longer than most, and you'll notice the sound quality is a little different too, as Rob lives in Vancouver, BC, and we spoke over the internet. Our conversation touches on topics including preparing and delivering speeches in forums like conferences, knowing and reading your audience, authentic communication and the importance of practicing to achieve it, and a variety of tips and tricks to improve your communication skills in a variety of settings. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Rob Cottingham. My guest today is Rob Cottingham. Rob has 30 years of experience as a speechwriter and speech coach. I've actually known him for nearly half that time through our attendance at the same conferences, including the Web of Change and N10, a conference for the nonprofit sector. And I've always been impressed by his presentations and his communication skills writ large. Were it not for social media, I fear that I would have lost touch with someone like Rob. But thanks to Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, I've been entertained by his noise-to-signal cartoons and more. Recently, Rob launched a podcast, Leadership Communications, where he shares lessons from his career as a speechwriter and speech coach. Rob Cottingham, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thank you so much. It's great to be part of the podcast.
So I want to start by saying that Leadership Communications, the first 30 episodes, are amazing. And for those listening, if you think that that means 30 episodes times 30 minutes, it's actually about 10 minutes or less for each episode, and they are fantastic. And it makes me feel like I haven't had an original thought in my mind because you share so much of the advice and wisdom that I share with students every time that I present on the topic. So kudos to you. Great work on that.
Well, thank you. I've tried to keep them both bite-sized and useful, like practically useful. So I do a little bit of pontificating because I am a human being with opinions, but for the most part, I try to keep it down to practical advice that people can actually put to work.
Can you start by just giving us the capsule explanation of your career? How'd you get to where you are now?
It started arguably by being laid off from a job I had with the peace movement. I was working for an organization called Operation Dismantle, and we were a little too successful in shutting down a particular weapons program in Canada. Donations suddenly dried up. I was out on the street without a job at the same time as a leadership campaign was getting started for the New Democratic Party, which is basically Canada's equivalent of a very liberal wing of the Democrats. And I walked into that leadership campaign office, said, I would love to write for you. They said, can you write speeches? I said, yeah, sure. And they put me to work doing that. And the next thing I know, the speech writing had gone well. She had won. She was now the leader of the party. And I was writing speeches for a federal leader. And it really was as easy and complicated as that.
And over the years, you've worked in communications in many different capacities. What would you say has been the most formative of those experiences in terms of propelling your expertise in communications forward?
Probably working in election campaigns. There is something about that pressure cooker atmosphere where you are retired. There's something about that pressure cooker atmosphere where you're required to just come out with copy for speeches, bang, 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 to deadline, to the point where there would be times where I was concealing my laptop from the flight crew, pounding out the last few minutes of a speech as we were heading down toward the airport where the leader would be giving the speech on the tarmac. And under that kind of pressure, you learn very quickly how to distill something into a simple story, how to figure out what the message is and what you want to do with an audience, and just very quickly cut through everything else and understand what the story is at the heart of what you want to say. And that, more than anything else, I think, has shaped the discipline side, I guess, of myself as a communicator. And the other work that I've done with this wonderful group of folks called the Now Group over the last 2 decades, that's been incredibly important, because that was really where I had my big apprenticeship, working with folks who are very, very talented, very smart, very insightful, and experienced, and helping me to take whatever raw talent I was bringing here and think it through in terms of larger communications campaigns, and see how the work I was doing in a wide variety of areas, because it's a small agency, everybody fills in for something, see how whatever work I was doing on a project fit into a larger campaign and help propel a larger narrative.
Now, a lot of the advice in your podcast is really geared towards prepared speeches from a stage, from a script. And you have some advice, obviously, that is more about spontaneous communication. But I'm wondering how you view those two things as different. Obviously, when we have the time to write out a script and then commit it to memory or to a variety of note forms that we can refer back to, it's different than when we are in a situation of having to speak spontaneously. How do you view those two things differently?
I think, first of all, they have a lot in common in that you want to achieve some objective. It's not just a question of getting up there and filling time, with a few exceptions like filibusters in a legislature. But ultimately, you want to move the audience from thinking and feeling and acting one way to hopefully inspiring, leading, informing them to think and feel and act another. So I think you have to do that same strategic and tactical process, whether you're speaking off the cuff or from a piece that you've been working on for 2 months. The differences, I think, lie mainly in recognizing the limitations that you have with both of them, and setting some expectations for yourself, and making sure that that you're going to be achieving something, that you're setting yourself goals that are actually achievable. In an impromptu speech, chances are you're not going to be delivering a message for the ages, but you do want to achieve some discrete objective. Whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, knowing what that is and then directing your entire speech towards it is critical. I think, too, with an impromptu speech, you have to recognize that because this isn't necessarily going to be golden oratory, that you're probably going to want to keep it shorter than you would for a longer prepared speech. But you can also always draw on stories you've told before and examples that you have in the back of your mind. A lot of the impromptu off-the-cuff speeches that you hear and see are actually speeches that have been years in the making, because they draw on stories that the speaker has been relating an awful lot over the years. So yes, there isn't a written prepared text for it, but there might be one that just says, tell the dead pigeon story here. And if you have that in your mind and you have a bit of a repertoire of those kind of stories to be able to tell to back up particular points, then you're going to be able to deliver a more expansive speech. So I think it really does come down in many ways to expectation.
I like to think of that often as the difference between spontaneous and extemporaneous. So the idea that extemporaneous takes a look at all of our experience over time and then channeling it into that moment, rather than showing up just completely unprepared and saying whatever comes into your mind, right? And I find that, when you become a specialist on a particular topic, it becomes very easy to give extemporaneous speeches or presentations on that topic. And that's very different than being asked to hold forth on something that you really have no preparation on and have to make it up as you go along.
Sarah Hurwitz has a great interview in a podcast I was listening to just this morning, Michelle Obama's speechwriter. And she was saying, what is more authentic? Is it the speech that you just dash off the top of your head in 5 minutes with whatever ideas happen to come to mind? Or is it the one that you have labored over for weeks getting the thoughts just right and reflecting on it and understanding exactly what the truth is that you want to impart to people. We have an idea that spontaneity and authenticity are the same thing. And often all it is you're capturing somebody, yes, in the moment, they're saying whatever happens to come to mind, but that isn't necessarily true to what they honestly believe, especially on reflection. I think we undervalue thoughtfulness a whole lot, and we overvalue these immediate hot takes, whether it's from the stage or in social media.
I was going to say that is a commentary for the age we live in today, right? The instantaneous feedback or spouting off, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter, versus the much more thoughtful communication. Even a written blog post can take a lot more thought than posting something to Twitter, obviously. And I think it brings me to the next topic that I really want to talk about, because what I do here at the university is work with business students at the Foster School, helping them present themselves in the most authentic way possible in job interviews often. And some students come in thinking that, again, that authenticity comes from spontaneity rather than from the preparation. Mm-hmm. And to present yourself authentically and to present yourself really well and to show the value that you can bring to an organization and to talk about your past experiences takes a lot of preparation. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or advice on how students or anyone can prepare for that kind of a situation.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things you can do is actually rehearse. Work with somebody who you feel safe rehearsing with, and actually go through the questions that you're likely to face, the difficult ones as well as the easy ones. I think you actually do want to rehearse the easy ones. You want to be able to have your answers as strong as possible, because these are the places where you're actually going to be able to really show your greatest strengths, but also those difficult ones, and not to hold back at all. You want to face them in as tough a circumstances as you can realistically imagine, because that way, when you're actually going in front of the real thing and it's the real interview, this isn't the first time you've answered this question. Instead, you've worked it through and you've understood, okay, if I start going down this particular path, it leads to a dead end, so I'm not going to do that. And I think the way that you stay authentic in situations like that is by recognizing we all have different faces, different facets of ourselves that we present to the world in different contexts. We do it all the time. When you're talking to a kid, you're using a different set of expressions, facial expressions, phrases, tone of voice, body language, than when you are talking to a lover, than when you're talking to your parents, than when you're talking to a colleague, than when you're talking to a prospective employer. And it's reasonable that we do these things because different contexts demand different aspects of ourselves. And making those choices intentional is just a degree of thoughtfulness in conveying what it is that's the most useful for everybody concerned in that circumstance.
The time that you spend talking with, in our case, perhaps an alumni or a fellow student or interviewer, recruiter, all of those are very different. And understanding your audience, I think it was one of your first episodes of Leadership Communication, was the importance of understanding your audience. And that's not just when you're giving a formal speech, but when you're telling a story, when you're giving an interview, for example, understanding who it is that you're talking to, what's most important to them, and how you can give them what they need to make the decision that you hope they'll make.
Yes. I think seeing conversations like this not as some kind of zero-sum game where they are trying to get you to trip up and you are trying to fool them, which I think is in some ways how a lot of people at least subconsciously see a job interview, and instead seeing it as an opportunity for the two of you to have a conversation about whether this position is right for you and whether you're right for this position. I think going into it with that latter mindset is going to be a lot more useful.
I'm glad you brought up mindset, because I do think that it's important, and it's something that people might not put enough attention on, whether it's in the interview context or in the presentation context. I recently listened to a podcast by the author of the book Psyched Up. This author took a look at the pre-performance routines of athletes and artists. And it got me thinking about the pre-performance routines that I have myself for when I'm giving presentations and what I recommend to my students for before interviews or before presentations. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, on pre-performance preparation in the immediate 15 to 30 minutes before going out on stage or before having to deliver important communication.
Yeah, I do. There's a few different aspects of this that I think are worth teasing out. The first is just the one that I think most people worry about is nerves. They're concerned that they're going to feel anxious in advance of speaking, and you get a bit of a positive feedback loop going. You're worried about being anxious, which makes you feel anxious, so your fight or flight mechanism kicks in, so you start possibly shaking a little bit, your voice picks up a tremble, and that makes you less confident, and you have to disrupt that process with some conscious techniques, and different things work for different people. So breathing works for an awful lot of people, just consciously slowing down your breathing, taking deep breath in, holding it, letting that breath out. Meditation, even for 5 minutes beforehand, can go a long way towards calming your inner reptilian brain that thinks it's about to be stomped on, and allowing yourself to master the situation a little more. I think having a really good sense of how you are going to begin before you speak is critical. You want to be able to walk up to the microphone with absolute confidence in the first sentence that's going to come out of your mouth. That way, you don't have that moment of hesitation that, thanks, kind of speaking that you sometimes hear, or the minute or two of like kind of verbal throat clearing that goes on. Thank you. It's great to be here. It's a lovely day. Wasn't lunch delicious? A round of applause for all the people who fed us. Yeah, that was awesome. So about ocelots, and finally getting to the topic you're talking to. Instead, when you know exactly what it is you're going to say, you're able to both convey confidence to the audience, but also remind yourself that, yeah, you actually do know what you're doing. I've become a fan in recent years of vocal warm-ups, those things you'll sometimes see actors do where they'll recite some kind of odd little tongue twister.
I often recommend students watch the Julian Treasure TED Talk, How to Speak So People Will Listen. And he goes through a number of good vocal warm-ups. And I say to people, I ask when I give a presentation, who here's a runner? People raise their hands. I go, would you run without stretching? Nobody raises their hands. I say, I run without stretching because only time I run is when I run for the bus. But when I am getting ready to give a presentation or give a speech, especially if it's early in the morning, and I haven't been speaking a lot, I warm up my voice and I warm up my face so that I can be expressive and so that my mouth will open and the words can actually get out of my mouth.
We think of our mouths and our voices as tools, but they're also instruments, and they need that level of care and thoughtfulness into using them if we're going to get the most out of them. And there's a whole bunch of things that you can also think of. There are people who, for instance, won't eat dairy for an entire day before they have a critical speech because they've found that seems to thicken up their voice a little bit. Having a little water beforehand, having water on hand, I find is absolutely essential for me, because there does come a point where your voice, it wants a little bit of lubrication. Thank you.
So you've talked about intention and deliberateness a couple times. I'm wondering if you can unpack that just a little bit more, especially in crafting a message and in the process of working a speech. And for the purposes here, when I say speech, that's anything that's prepared, such as a prepared answer to interview questions. What can people do to be more deliberate and intentional in that preparation process?
I think part of the trick is to think of this as any other communications effort. You have an audience, and you want a picture of what's going on in their mind before your speech. You want a picture of what you would like to have going on in their minds after your speech. And the purpose of your speech is to take them from that first picture to that second picture. I've sometimes called that the audience journey. And your speech is the roadmap that you'll all be following together on this journey. Hopefully, they will stick around with you throughout it and get to the same destination. When I talk about intentional at the most basic level, that's what I'm thinking of with intentional speaking. And in case anybody thinks that that's manipulative, I believe completely in being absolutely transparent about what it is you'd like to achieve with your audience, talking to them about, I want you at the end of this to understand that you have far more power than you think you do. Or my goal here today is to help every one of you see how much you can accomplish with just 5 words into the mirror in the morning, whatever it is that you're hoping to accomplish. With a job interview, because everybody's goals are very clear from the kind of roles you have, you don't need that kind of statement right up front. But knowing what it is for yourself in advance, I think that's absolutely critical. And then at a more granular level, making sure that everything that is in your speech and in your delivery helps to support that ultimate objective. You don't just have a joke in your speech because you want the audience to laugh. You have it because at this point on the journey, it's a useful thing to have. It would be great to dispel tension that may have built up at this point. Or it's helpful in engendering more of a sense of trust or shared experience in the audience. You are shifting from one emotional tone to another because it makes sense in the overall emotional journey that you're taking the audience on for that to happen now. You are increasing your tempo here because you want to convey urgency, you want to convey excitement, or this is a list of things that doesn't deserve to have every single point hammered on. Whatever it is, you should have a reason for making the choices that you're making.
I think that's critical advice, and I give it often, which is that, especially when you're preparing a presentation, it's so critical that you understand why everything is in that presentation, because anything that isn't intentional and anything that doesn't move your story forward or that doesn't contribute to persuading your audience, if it's a persuasive presentation, distracts and is an opportunity for you to lose your audience rather than to draw them in closer. And I think that goes for any type of communication, right?
Absolutely. Media relations, going off on a tangent is an opportunity for the story to be about something else.
I often use some of the language of media relations when speaking with students, flagging. Like the most important thing I learned as a flag, or there are 3 things that happened that contributed to this success, right? Mm-hmm. Using those signposting and flagging in your presentation or even in your interview, so that it's a way of snapping your audience's attention, whether that's, 10 people, 100 people, or one person across the interview table from you, back to what it is that you're about to say. And it helps your audience then follow the logic of the argument that you're making.
I especially like that because it lays down a bit of a fence for both you and your audience. When you know that you're going to be talking about these 3 things, then you're a lot less likely to head off on that tangent, and they're not waiting for you to go off on thing 4, 5, and 6. I do remember hearing a political leader give a speech about 20 years ago where he said he was going to set out the 4 precepts of social democracy, and by the time we were on precept 7, I realized something had gone off the rails.
Yeah. I sometimes say that if you start out with saying there are going to be 3 things and then you don't enumerate, and the second is, and the third is, it can often get confusing because you might slip in something in your explanation that sounds like you've moved on to the next one, but you really haven't moved on to the next one. So I think that if you're going to use that signposting, it's important to be consistent in the signposting. I'm going to talk about 3 things. The first thing, now I'm moving on to the second thing, and now the third thing, so that your audience, again, can follow it. Your job as a communicator is helping your audience understand the thing that you're talking about. That's the goal. That's your job.
You think about highway signposts, and what's remarkable about that, they're incredibly standardized, right down to the typeface and the kerning. And what that says to speakers, I think, is that there is great value in bringing in a little of that standardization when you're doing signposting for your audience. A little parallel structure goes a long way. And then they know, yeah, this is the third part of the speech. And let's face it, being an audience member is not generally a particularly comfortable experience. It's very passive. You're being spoken at. Chances are the seating isn't terribly comfortable. So no matter how interesting the subject matter is, no matter how riveting the speaker is, it's good to know when the end is coming. And that kind of signposting lets them know, okay, I've got 5 minutes more to expend on paying attention until I can kind of relax those attentional muscles.
Rob, in one of the episodes of your podcast, you talked about the difficulty of discerning between resting audience face and disinterested audience face and engaged or inquisitive audience face. Basically, the idea that it's very difficult to determine what is happening in an audience member's mind from looking at their face because, as you said, the experience of being an audience member is often very passive. I'm wondering if you have any advice for how people can read an audience during a presentation or speech.
I do. It's a tricky thing. There are a lot of factors that are outside of your control that could be affecting whether an audience looks like they're actively engaged. And you may not be able to tell all of it from the way that they're responding to you. Positive signs you can take as positive signs. If they're looking at you, they're nodding, they're making eye contact, they're on their feet cheering, whatever it happens to be, you can take that at face value, as it were. Other signs, though, that, limp, passive kind of face, you just have to take as your default assumption that they are engaged, they're listening to you, and they're getting what you're saying. You may want to, from time to time, stop and poll the audience and say, but I know other people have different experiences. Quick show of hands. How many people have ever? And you more or less ask your audience to give you a quick check-in that they are listening, they are paying attention, and they are relating to what you're talking to. Encouraging some degree of interaction, whether it is just a quick show of hands or an exercise or questions at the midpoint, can go a long way towards giving you that little bit of confidence and check-in. One thing to watch for, though, are active signs of people checking out, literally walking out the door, starting to talk a little bit amongst themselves. You cannot anymore really take the fact that people are looking at their devices or laptops as a sign that they aren't engaging. It has unfortunately become a bit of a norm for audiences to be doing that during speeches. And sometimes it's because what you've said is so exciting and interesting that they felt the need to share it on Twitter or note it down as for their own reference later. But sometimes it means that they've decided that either Angry Birds or email is a more viable option for them right now.
Or that eBay auction is about to end.
Yes. And honestly, if it's a good enough deal, no speech on earth is going to tear them from it. The other thing is to not get too psyched out if you have a few audience members that just aren't engaging. They're sitting there looking cross, arms folded, giving you all sorts of hostile body language, or they are off in their own world. You're not going to bring 100% of most rooms with you. It's just human nature. And the larger the crowd, the greater the possibility that there will be people who have zoned out. You can't let your performance and success be measured by your ability to engage the most hostile or disengaged members of your audience. You have to be looking at where you're going with the bulk of your audience and whether you're able to keep them engaged and listening.
Shifting gears a little bit, are there podcasts or books that you recommend, other than your own podcast, of course, on the topic of communications, public speaking, or speechcraft?
I love Nancy Duarte's books. She's written several now. There is Slideology, Resonate, and
The HBR Guide to Persuasive Presentations,
yes,
which is another fantastic one from her that I absolutely love and highly recommend.
It's fantastic. It's like your MBA in public speaking in a book. And then there's another, Illuminate, that she co-wrote, and this is building speaking and other rituals into a broader strategy of change, which I think is just fantastic. This is one of those books that I think is still going to take a few years before its full impact starts to be felt, because it really is a transformative way of looking at speaking. There is a podcast, How to Own the Room, Viv Groskop. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. I do know it's a wonderful podcast. She actually was the interviewer for that interview with Sarah Hurwitz that I was talking about from the morning.
Okay.
And it's just this
How to Own the Room.
Absolutely wonderful series of interviews. Michael Port has both a book and a podcast. The book is wonderful. It's also available on audiobook, which means you have the added benefit of him reading it, and he has just a lovely voice. The book's there, and then the podcast, the episodes come out fairly irregularly, but when they do, they're great. They're golden. He's a wonderful interviewer. He has terrific guests on. Highly recommended.
Now, if you have the opportunity, I'm not going to say if you have the opportunity, because you do have the opportunity right now, to give one piece of advice to someone who is looking to advance their career, right? I mean, that's why people come to business school. Our students want to advance their career. Part of that, I would argue, and a lot of what I do, is to help them understand the importance of good communication skills in advancing their career. What one piece of specific advice would you give people, something that they can work on during their time in a 22-month MBA program related to public speaking, preparing to speak, and communication?
It would be to think in terms of generosity as opposed to marketing or selling yourself. And I'm not suggesting that because of some fundamental belief in sacrificial altruism. It's because I believe that when it comes to speaking, that is far more effective than...
Tell me more. Tell me more about what you mean when you say generosity from a speaker's standpoint.
It's sharing your insight and experience. And sometimes that means as well sharing the limitations of that experience and recognizing that you don't have all the answers, but sharing the answers that you do have and being curious and looking for what's remarkable and sharing that with people. Aiming to not just repeat received information from other gurus, but bringing yourself to it as well, and bringing, in addition to your own intellectual insights to things, your own emotional reaction to it. And that's a level of generosity that requires just a little bit of vulnerability. But that, I think, in speaking is what really allows you to make connections with people. And that's the power of speaking, is that personal connection. And you may be making it to several hundred people at once, or it may be just a small room full of people. But when you are conveying both information and emotion, and when you are speaking at some fundamental level, something that is true to you, then you're going to have this power. And it's not power over other people, but it is a power to move people that really is unparalleled in any other communications medium or channel. And understanding that and making responsible use of it, and again, being generous in how you're using it and looking to be of service to your audiences, I think fundamentally that is, first of all, great for the world, but secondly, it's going to be good for you. It's going to be what allows you to develop the trusted relationships that you need for your career to progress.
I love that idea of being in service to your audience. I think that is, for me, one of the keys to speaking. And it's the difference between selling and communicating and connecting. No one wants to be sold to, right? But when you're in service to your audience, they feel like they're getting value from the time that they're spending, the attention that they're devoting to you.
It's amazing going to conferences and you'll see somebody go up on the stage, and there is, I think, just this default level of openness that audiences have to speakers. And you get an initial, kind of like at the beginning of Monopoly, where you're given a certain amount of money to start with. You're given a certain amount of goodwill to start with.
Yeah, they're in the room. They're in the room. They looked at the program. They're in the room. They want to hear from you, right?
And they want you to succeed and do well. And if the first thing you do is then start pitching to them, you blow through that goodwill immediately, and it is awfully hard to get that back. I'm not a believer in pitching from the stage in circumstances like that. I think that what you do is you can show people that you have a level of understanding and knowledge and insight and empathy for the challenges that they're facing, the issues they're dealing with, and the solutions they're looking for. But what's really important for you is to be in service to your audience. And that ultimately is going to be in service to you.
Thank you so much, Rob, for taking the time to talk with me today. I would love for you to share where people can find out more about you.
You can find me online at robcottingham.ca. The podcast is robcottingham.ca/podcast. And I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and most of the social networks out there just as Rob Cottingham, all one word. It's been a real pleasure.
Rob has tremendous experience and expertise in the field of communication, and I had to cut a lot out of our conversation. But the good news is, if you want to learn more from him, you can check out episodes of his podcast, Leadership Communications, just about wherever you listen to podcasts. MBA students might find episode 48 on origin stories helpful in thinking about how to answer the common interview question, "Tell me about yourself." You can find information about Rob's podcast, as well as other resources we mentioned, in the show notes and at conversationsoncareers.com. Thank you for listening to another episode of Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. You can email me at gheller@uw.edu. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or classmate. What's your favorite tongue twister?
Right now, because I have a little bit of a sibilance issue, it's amidst the mists and fiercest frosts, with stoutest fists and proudest boasts, he thrusts his fists against the posts and still insists he sees the ghosts.